There are moments in life when everything on the outside looks completely normal, yet something on the inside begins to feel different in a way that cannot be easily explained, as if the noise of daily life is still there but another voice is quietly rising beneath it, not loud, not forceful, but persistent in a way that gently disturbs the comfort of routine. It often begins with a simple thought that doesn't seem important at first, a small impression in the heart, a repeated idea that returns even when the mind tries to move away from it, or a strange sense of awareness that something is being noticed from within that the outside world cannot see. People usually try to label it quickly, calling it overthinking, stress, tiredness, or imagination, because the mind prefers explanations that feel logical, but this inner movement does not always fit into logic. It feels deeper, more personal, like it is connected to something beyond everyday thinking, something that touches the emotional core rather than just the surface of thought. In these silent inner moments, life does not stop, but perception begins to shift, and what once felt ordinary starts to feel slightly different, not because the world has changed, but because awareness within has changed, and this shift creates a subtle tension between ignoring and noticing, between continuing as before and pausing for reflection, and this is where the inner experience becomes powerful, because it does not demand attention loudly, it simply keeps returning, gently. Consistently, almost like a reminder that refuses to disappear no matter how many times it is pushed aside. At first, the human response is usually resistance, because anything that interrupts comfort is seen as unnecessary, and the mind tries to protect its normal flow by dismissing what feels unfamiliar. But the strange thing about these inner promptings is that they do not always fade with resistance, instead they often become clearer in silence, stronger in stillness, and more noticeable when distraction is reduced, as if attention itself gives them more space to exist, not because they are created by attention, but because attention removes the noise that hides them. And in that space between distraction and awareness, something very subtle begins to happen. The emotional state becomes more sensitive, not in a painful way at first, but in a perceptive way, where small things feel slightly more meaningful than before, where thoughts that were previously ignored begin to carry emotional weight, and where decisions that once felt simple now seem to carry deeper consequences. Even if nothing outside has changed yet, everything inside starts to feel more significant, more connected, more aligned with something that cannot yet be fully defined. There are moments when a person may find themselves thinking about something repeatedly without intention, not because they are forcing it, but because it keeps returning naturally, like a soft echo that does not fade completely, and this repetition creates curiosity, and curiosity slowly replaces dismissal, and in that transition, the heart begins to lean slightly toward listening instead of ignoring, even when the mind is still unsure about what exactly is being heard. This inner experience often feels like a gentle interruption in the flow of normal life, not destructive, not chaotic, but quietly persistent, and it can appear during the most ordinary situations, while walking, sitting alone, or even in moments of rest, where suddenly the attention turns inward without clear reason, and in that inward turn, there is a sense that something important is being pointed toward, not with urgency, but with quiet importance that feels difficult to ignore for too long. People often describe this as intuition, inner voice, or a feeling in the heart, but regardless of the label, the experience itself carries a consistent quality. It does not force action immediately, it creates awareness first, and awareness is always the beginning of change, because once something is truly seen internally, it cannot be unseen in the same way again, even if it is temporarily ignored. What makes this experience even more powerful is that it does not come with clear instructions, it does not explain everything at once, it does not reveal the full picture immediately, instead it unfolds slowly, like layers being uncovered over time, and this gradual unfolding creates a sense of curiosity mixed with uncertainty, where the mind wants clarity but the experience offers only awareness. And in that gap between clarity and awareness, reflection begins to grow naturally. Sometimes, this inner stirring feels like a reminder that something has been overlooked, not in a judgmental way, but in a gentle way, as if attention is being redirected towards something that matters more than what is currently occupying the mind, and this redirection can feel uncomfortable because it interrupts emotional routine, but at the same time it also feels meaningful, because it carries a sense that it is not random. It has direction even if that direction is not yet fully visible. In psychological terms, this state can be understood as heightened inner awareness where the subconscious mind brings certain thoughts closer to conscious attention, especially those that carry emotional significance, unresolved feelings, or important decisions, and when these thoughts rise repeatedly, they create the impression of a guiding presence within, not because something external is forcing it, but because internal processing is trying to bring attention to what has been mentally or emotionally postponed. And yet, despite all possible explanations, the experience still feels personal, as if it is not just thought activity but something deeper in meaning, something that touches identity, direction, or purpose, and this feeling is what makes it difficult to ignore completely, because even when logic tries to dismiss it, emotional awareness continues to register its presence. In this state, life does not become confusing in a chaotic way, but it becomes reflective in a quiet way, where ordinary moments start carrying subtle meaning, and silence begins to feel less empty and more expressive, as if silence itself is part of communication happening within the self, and in that silence, understanding begins to form slowly, not through answers, but through awareness of questions that were never asked before. And so the inner experience continues to return, not aggressively, not urgently, but consistently enough to be noticed, and in that consistency lies its influence, because what returns repeatedly eventually becomes difficult to fully ignore, not because it forces itself, but because it keeps inviting attention in a calm and persistent manner that slowly shifts perception from dismissal to reflection when a person finally stops resisting that quiet inner stirring and allows even a small moment of attention toward it. Something subtle but deeply transformative begins to unfold, not in a dramatic external way, but in an internal shift that changes how reality is perceived, as if the same life is still being lived, yet it is now being seen through a slightly different lens, where ordinary moments carry more meaning, and previously ignored thoughts begin to reveal layers that were not visible before. And this change does not happen all at once, it arrives gradually, like light slowly entering a room that has been closed for a long time. In that space of awareness, the mind starts to notice patterns that were always present but never fully acknowledged, small emotional signals, repeated thoughts, delayed feelings, or sudden reflections that seem to arise without clear cause, and instead of pushing them away immediately, there is now a moment of pause, a moment where reaction is replaced by observation, and in that observation something important happens. The inner noise that once dominated attention begins to lose intensity. Not because it disappears completely, but because it is no longer being resisted in the same way. This shift creates a strange kind of calmness, not the calmness of emptiness, but the calmness of understanding beginning to form, where confusion is no longer the only emotional response, and curiosity starts to take its place, and curiosity is powerful because it does not reject what it does not understand, it explores it, and in that exploration, the heart begins to connect dots that previously felt unrelated, moments, thoughts, and feelings that once seemed random now begin to appear connected in a deeper internal pattern. As this awareness deepens, the person may begin to reflect on decisions that were delayed, feelings that were ignored, or situations that were emotionally confusing at the time, and now those same experiences start to appear differently, not necessarily with full clarity, but with a sense that there was more happening beneath the surface than was originally recognized, and this realization does not create fear. It creates responsibility, a quiet understanding that awareness brings the need for honesty with oneself. In this stage, the inner experience is no longer just about receiving subtle signals, it becomes about interpreting them with patience, because rushing interpretation often leads back to confusion, but allowing space for reflection creates a more stable understanding, where thoughts are not immediately judged as right or wrong, but are observed as part of a larger emotional process that is still unfolding. There is also a deeper psychological shift that occurs here, where the mind stops treating every inner signal as something to be ignored or acted upon instantly, and instead begins to recognize that some thoughts are not instructions but reflections, not commands but awareness points, and this distinction is important because it changes the relationship between the self and inner experience, turning it from conflict into dialogue rather than reaction. In this dialogue, silence itself begins to feel different, it is no longer empty or uncomfortable, but more like space where understanding can grow, and in that space, the heart starts to feel less pressure to respond immediately to every inner impulse, and instead learns to sit with it, to observe it, and to allow meaning to form naturally rather than forcing conclusions too quickly. At the same time, there is a realization that not every inner feeling requires immediate external action. Some feelings exist to increase awareness, some exist to bring attention to neglected areas of life, and some exist simply to slow down the pace of emotional blindness that can happen when life becomes too routine, and understanding this brings a sense of maturity in perception, where the inner world is no longer seen as confusing noise, but as layered communication that requires patience rather than resistance. In this process, the emotional sensitivity that once felt overwhelming begins to stabilize, not because feelings become weaker, but because understanding becomes stronger, and when understanding grows, emotional reactions lose some of their urgency, because the mind is no longer interpreting every internal signal as threat or pressure, but as information that can be processed gradually. And still, even in this calmer state, there remains a sense of mystery, because not everything becomes fully clear at once, and that is part of the process, because inner awareness is not designed to reveal everything immediately, it unfolds in stages, and each stage brings a slightly deeper level of understanding, where earlier confusion turns into reflection, and reflection slowly turns into insight. There are moments where the person may still feel uncertain, still feel questioning, still feel the pull of old habits that encourage ignoring or dismissing inner signals, but now there is also a second voice present, a quieter but steadier awareness that suggests pausing before reacting, observing before deciding, understanding before concluding. And this balance between old reaction and new awareness creates a space where growth becomes possible without force. Over time, this repeated choice of awareness over dismissal begins to reshape how the inner world is experienced, because what is repeatedly noticed eventually becomes integrated, and what is integrated becomes part of perception, and when perception changes, response naturally changes as well, not through pressure, but through understanding. In this deeper state, life does not become free of inner signals, but those signals no longer feel like disturbances, they begin to feel like guidance toward reflection, toward awareness of things that might otherwise remain unnoticed, and even if their full meaning is not immediately clear, the relationship with them changes from resistance to curiosity, from confusion to patience, from dismissal to gentle attention. And in that transformation, something very quiet but very important takes place. The inner world stops being something to escape from, and starts becoming something to understand, and in that understanding, the person begins to experience a different kind of stability, not based on control over every thought, but based on trust in the process of awareness itself, where even uncertainty is no longer seen as something to fear, but as part of unfolding clarity that reveals itself step by step over time.